Thank you, Shannon. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. It is going to be awesome. I am Nathaniel Stinnett, the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. I am going to start sharing my screen. What we are going to have for you this evening is in four parts here. So first, I am going to give a lightning quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. You all are not here to learn about EVP tonight. You're here to hear from some expert organizers of climate voters, climate activists, and older climate activists. So I'm going to give you a very quick intro to EVP. Then I'm going to go over some of our recent data about older climate voters. Then we're going to jump in to the panel discussion with our organizing experts. And then we're going to field questions from you for our panel. Sound good? All right. And we will respect your time and try to finish right at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Let's get going. For those of you who don't know about the Environmental Voter Project, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on finding people who already care deeply about climate and the environment, yet don't vote, and then turning them into consistent voters. That's it. That's what we focus on. We don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to get people to care more about climate or the environment. We are purely a behavior change organization. We find the people who don't need their minds changed because they're already with us, but they're not voting. So what they need is a behavioral intervention. And we do this in a four-step process. And again, forgive me that I'm going to breeze through this, but I know that you're not here to learn about EVP here today. First, we build predictive models on voter files. This is a sophisticated way to individually target voters, the same way that presidential campaigns are now targeting voters. We're individually targeting voters who have a very high likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but quite literally listing it as their number one priority over all other issues. So we individually identify these voters. Then we get rid of the ones who are already good voters, already consistent voters. They don't need a behavioral intervention, right? So now we've got the low propensity environmental voters, the ones who are unlikely to vote in a particular election. Then we move to step two, mobilization. We work in hundreds of elections each year. We've got, at last count, over 6,000 volunteers who help us canvass, call, send postcards to these voters. We also do digital ads and direct mail, all informed by cutting-edge, behavioral science-informed messaging that's designed to just do one thing, and that is turn non-voters into new voters and new voters into consistent voters. Three, habit reinforcement. We live behavioral science every day, but for many of you, even if you don't live behavioral science, you probably intuitively understand that you can't change someone's habits by only talking to them every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. And so we treat every election, no matter how small, as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. We will mobilize low propensity environmental voters for like library trustee races and dog catcher races. Not because they're particularly important for environmental policymaking, they're not, but they're crucial for changing people's behavior. And that gets us to step four, changing the electorate. Ultimately, what our goal is to make it impossible for anybody to run for any office anywhere without saying, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because at the end of the day, nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And if we can dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who vote, not the non-voters, but the voters, well, politicians will follow, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they want to win. And so that's what we're focused on at EVP. Very, very quickly, we measure our impact in two ways. The first way is randomized control trials. What this allows us to do is set aside a control group of these low propensity environmental voters and not talk to them. Then we see what turnout is among the ones we did talk to and compare it to that control group. And that allows us to isolate what our sole impact is on turnout with all this behavioral science-informed messaging. And just looking back since 2020, 2021, 2022, and the first half of this last year, 2023, we've been solely responsible for increasing turnout among these targets, sometimes as much as 5 percentage points over our control group, which is a big, big number in this business. And then the second metric we use is cumulatively over the long term. We have now individually communicated with 9.5 million of these low propensity environmental voters. As of about 10 months ago, and we're going to re-up this data in a few months, almost 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. Now, to be clear, this is different from a randomized control trial. We can't claim that we're solely responsible for making these 1.5 million super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. No one else has been involved in close to 2,000 different elections over the last 5 years. So we're very, very proud of this. That's it. That's all I'm going to tell you about the Environmental Voter Project. If you want more information, please go to our website, environmentalvoter.org. Okay, before we get into our panel, we want to share some really interesting data from all this research that we do. Because remember, if we're trying to identify environment first and climate first voters, and then mobilize the ones who need it, well, we can look at that identification data and realize some really interesting stuff. And one thing that we realized, we put together into a report called Gray is the New Green, which we can share with you in the chat. And it covered these 18 states. What these 18 states represent are the 19 states that the Environmental Voter Project works in, minus Alaska. We couldn't include Alaska because they don't share a lot of demographic information about their voters, so it just would have warped the analysis. These are the 18 states that are covered. Before we jump into the data, a little bit about terminology. When I say the words climate voters, what I'm referring to is people who have a greater than 75% likelihood of listing either climate change or clean air, clean water in the environment as their number one priority over all other issues. Their number one priority. The racial demographic information that we use is going to use the same terminology that's in voter files. So we're going to use terms like Hispanic, Native American, and we're just using that to be precise within the bounds of what's given in the voter file. And then finally, voter file information does not have gender information. They have sex information. And I just want to be clear that when I refer to male and female identifiers, it's because we're getting that information direct from voter files. All right, this is what we found. Across all 18 of these states, one thing that might not surprise you is, oh, wow, 18 to 34-year-olds, there are a whole bunch of them who list climate or other environmental issues as a top priority, almost 30%. That probably isn't surprising. But the second largest group of these climate first voters was among registered voters age 65 and up. The average across these 18 states was 16.4%. I think that's really important for people to let sink in because it cuts against what most people have in their mind, which is, the older you get, the less likely you are to care about climate change. That is not what we are seeing in our data. And moreover, this isn't a situation where like the mean is different from the median here. Yes, this is what the state average is, but look, when we break it out in various states, just looking at these 4 very important battleground states, you'll see there isn't much variation. Yeah, the numbers go up and down a little bit by various age groups, but the trends are remarkably consistent. In fact, and this is kind of a messy graph, but if you lay all 18 states down on the same graph, look at that. Look how consistent that is. It's like a Nike swoosh or something, where people age 65 and up have clearly, at least in these 18 states, become the second largest age group of climate first voters. just a few more minutes before we get to the panel. What do we know about these older climate first voters? Well, first of all, there is a significant gender gap. Again, when I say gender, what I really mean is a sex gap, because that's the data that we have from the voter file. So voters age 65 and up who are likely to list climate and the environment as their top priority, 59.3% of them are women, only 40% are men. For some context, if you just look at all registered voters in these 18 states, so forget the climate first ones, just sort of a baseline of all registered voters, yeah, there's still a gender gap, a pretty significant gender gap. There's always a gender gap among registered voters where there are more women than men. And then the older you get, women live longer than men, so the gender gap grows. But still, that's only a 10-point gender gap. Whereas if you look at these older climate voters, it's almost a 20-point gender gap. It's almost twice as big. So these older climate voters are much more likely to be women than men, even more than we see in the underlying baseline data. All right, if we look at the racial demographics of this group, what you would see here would be very different if we were looking at younger climate voters or even middle-aged climate voters. There, it is disproportionately people of color. But when you get into this older age group, it is disproportionately white. So again, the yellow bars are the underlying sort of the baseline of registered voters in these 18 states. In these 18 states, voters age 65 and up, 77% of them are white, but 83.6% of these climate first older voters are white. Where we see a little bit of difference, a little bit of interesting things to sort of pull out from the underlying data is also that these older climate voters are much less likely to be Hispanic. That's something that also sort of jumps out at us. The other stuff, I'm not sure that those numbers are big enough differences to really read much into. Final thing that I'll just say before we get to the panel is what these percentages represent is, if you think of like a denominator as being all registered voters in a state, these percentages are a numerator of climate first voters age 65 and up. So let me put that another way. Let's look at a battleground state here, Arizona. 4.8% of all registered voters in the state of Arizona are 65 and older climate first voters. Now, many of them might not show up, right? We're just talking about registered voters. We're not even dealing with vote propensity, right? Some of these people might not vote. Some of them might always vote. But this gives you an idea of not just the existing political power of this population of activists, but also the potential political power of this population of activists. Older climate voters can make an enormous difference. And just in closing, I will remind you all, when was the last time there was an election where 100% of all registered voters showed up? Never. Never. So actually, the denominator shouldn't be all registered voters. Actually, older climate voters always have more power than the numbers that you see here, because actual turnout is much lower than 100% of registered voters. And obviously, the lower turnout gets, the more local you get, even more power lies in the hands of these older climate voters. So this is the data that we have been seeing that we wanted to share with all of you as just a preface to this discussion. If you want more information, we will share this report in the chat. And now I want to get to the panel discussion. We have a really, really great group here to meet with you. Unfortunately, we do not have Judith LeBlanc with us. She is supposed to be here. She might be being held up somewhere, but we are really, really excited to have Dominique Browning, Bill McKibben, and Frances Stewart. Very, very briefly, Bill McKibben, many of you might know, is an author, an educator, an activist, founder of 350.org, more recently founder of Third Act, which I hope we're going to hear a lot about today. Dominique Browning is the director and co-founder of Moms Clean Air Force. And Frances Stewart is one of those indefatigable activists and volunteers who every organization says, "Dear God, thank you so much for sending us Frances." She is involved with so many groups that I can't list them all, but she is here today as a representative of Elders Climate Action and all of the amazing work that she does with them. So let's go ahead and get started. I'd love to start by just having each of the three of you speak for a minute or two about the work that your organizations do. So Dominique, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to start with you. Could you just introduce yourself and Moms Clean Air Force to everybody?
Sure. Dominique Browning, Moms Clean Air Force. We started Moms about 12 years ago. The idea is to mobilize the incredible passion that caregivers have for protecting children. And our goal has been to communicate science and policy, to engage people in the political process, to help people run for office, climate voters, and to as well change legislation, change legislation, and work very closely with EPA demanding strong rules. We see air pollution and climate emissions as inextricably linked in a very useful way for organizing purposes. And I would say we are a multi-generational organization. When my co-founder, Sue Mandel, and I started, we were mothers of young adults, and we are now grandmothers. And Elders Climate Action has been a partner of ours for many, many years at events in DC. So it's really wonderful to see. In fact, our fiercest and most tenacious and determined organizer, Hazel Chandler, age 77, is the mother of the COO of Elders Climate Action. So it just shows you how wonderfully linked we all are.
That is great. That is great. I didn't know that about Hazel. Thank you. Thank you, Dominique. And Bill, if you could go next, we'd love to hear a little bit about the work that Third Act does.
Sure. Third Act's a couple of years old, and we organize people over the age of 60 for action on climate and on democracy, because we think they're the two interlocked crises that actually are going to determine our fate. We do all kinds of things. We now have chapters pretty much every state in the country, and also big chapters of organized around what people did in their working lives. So Third Act lawyers, Third Act educators, Third Act healthcare workers, on and on and on. And we do every kind of thing, from phone banking and door knocking, because we have a 501c4 sort of political arm, to all kinds of direct organizing. Last spring, for instance, we organized 100 simultaneous demonstrations in 100 cities outside the big banks that fund the fossil fuel movement. I was in DC, where we had several thousand people shutting down those banks for a day by sitting in rocking chairs because we're too old to sprawl on the sidewalk. The New York Times called it the rocking chair rebellion the next day. And we tend to try and organize with as much kind of feistiness and juice as we can. When young people who I've spent most of my life organizing with start going on and on about okay boomer and things, I remind them that though they may be correct, it was our generation that did produce the best music of all time anyway. So we're always super happy to have Bette Midler and Patti Smith and Carole King and things helping us out in this work too. We think there's got to be some art and music thrown in with all the other parts of this good work.
Outstanding. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. And Judith, we are so happy to have you with us. We're going to let you just get settled for another second or two. I'm going to ask Frances to tell us about the work at Elders Climate Action, and then we'd love to get to you. So Francis, if you could go next and just give us a brief minute or two on the work of Elders Climate Action.
Sure. Elders Climate Action has been around for about 10 years now. Where nationwide we have roughly 27,000 members around the country. Some of them just involved with the national organization, some with local chapters, many people with both. And we really try to educate and inspire our members and to help them take action in ways that fit their lives and fit their concerns about the climate. So we have a lot of different possibilities for people to become involved, and we're big collaborators. Dominique mentioned our work with Moms Clean Air Force. We also have been collaborating with Third Act. One of our biggest collaborations for the last few years has been with the Environmental Voter Project, with our Elders Promote the Vote project. We do a lot of intergenerational work, and a lot of work on state and local levels, which can vary a lot. Our chapter in Ann Arbor did a lot of boots on the ground work, making curbside composting possible in Ann Arbor. Now that may sound like, what's that to do with climate? Think methane, very potent greenhouse gas. Other people are much more involved in high level policy. One of our members just came back from the COP. She goes every year. Many people are involved in work on their local level. Right now, I'm a little bit preoccupied with the state level because in Maryland, we have a 3-month General Assembly session, which starts next Tuesday. So we have lots of opportunities for people to be involved in a lot of different ways.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. And Judith, we are so happy to have you here. This is Judith LeBlanc, the Executive Director of the Native Organizers Alliance. And Judith, we're hoping that you could just start by letting folks know a little bit about the work that you do.
Well, I'm so glad to be here, and I'm sorry I'm late. I can only say one word: grandchildren. I will say no more. So my name is Judith LeBlanc. I'm a citizen of the Caddo Nation, and I am the Executive Director of the Native Organizers Alliance, which is a national Native network of tribal leaders, community organizers who believe and share the understanding that we need a values-driven strategy in order to build grassroots political power in Indian country, in order to meet the needs of our community, and as it's begun to be experienced, so that we can play our role in defending democracy in a very difficult political moment. We're born out of the grassroots organizing around the Affordable Care Act. So we actually were born on the run, driving in a campaign, and out of it came a circle of tribal and traditional leaders and community organizers who believe that in order to build political power, grassroots Native political power, that we needed to ensure that our tribal leaders, our traditional leaders, and our grassroots leader were walking on at least in the same direction, and on a good day on the same path towards a horizon that would ensure that we could realize sovereignty. Our work in the electoral arena and in voter protection and voter mobilization began in 2018. We were one of the two organizations. Four Directions is the other organization that were invited to work on Standing Rock to ensure the right to vote. When the legislature passed a bill to require street addresses, which just isn't a thing in Indian country on reservations, we were invited by the tribal leadership post Dakota Access Pipeline struggle to work on the res. And we worked with over 100 moccasins on the ground. We achieved a 94% voter turnout by ensuring that every single person would be registered to vote, and that the sovereign right of the tribe to create street addresses and voter IDs would happen, and that we would mobilize and ensure that anybody who wanted to vote would, and they did. And many of those that we worked with in the various communities across Standing Rock, they said, we've been waiting for another DAPL struggle, and this is it. So in 2020, we worked with our sister organization, Illuminative, which is a narrative change, national native narrative change organization. And we mobilized over 100 moccasins on the ground in 5 states, in 5 battleground states, to mobilize the vote, to educate the vote. And what we found, because we did a community survey of over 6,000 natives in 2020, that 87% of native voters in 2020 either studied the platform of the candidates or the voting record. So we have a highly educated electorate. And so many people, because of the impact of systemic racism, really had no idea that in 7 states, the native vote is one of the swing votes. And in 7 states, that's 77 electoral votes that are determined. And in Arizona, we showed quite clearly that we were the swing vote that flipped that state blue. In fact, the number of votes that Biden won by was almost the exact number of votes that were cast on the Navajo reservation, which had an 80% voter turnout. Usually it's 60. And they're, as I would say, because of my Boston background, I'm an Indian with a Boston accent. They're wicked smart on Navajo territory because they have their tribal elections on the same day as the national election. And so the turnout is always very high there, and therefore very important in the state of Arizona. So our commitment has grown to ensuring the right to vote. We're working in collaboration with the Native American Rights Fund and others who believe that in this electoral cycle, the Indian vote can play a big role in defending democracy. Because we are in those states, those battleground states, but also because we have a big stake in protecting the Constitution, because the Constitution is what guarantees our right to sovereignty. So without a much more deeply democratic electoral system and a more deeply democratic economic system, we have no hope to carry out our ancestors' dream of achieving sovereignty for all of our peoples. So that's what we're planning this year, is an all-out moccasins on the ground. We've got to do a lot more, I think, to help our people and all the people who believe in democracy, that the problems we face in this country, the threats to democracy, are not an electoral cycle problem. And that political power is built in between elections by the organizing to end the domination of the fossil fuel industry, the destruction of our lands due to fossil fuel and bad development decisions, and climate change. And so the power that is necessary to change the policies of this government is built in between elections, and elections are just a snapshot of the power that we've built. So I'm very happy to be here to have this conversation with the other leaders who I hold in high esteem.
Well, thank you, Judith. Thank you so much. And anybody who speaks in a Boston accent speaks directly to my heart. So I'm going to come right back to you.
Hat, please.
Yeah, my hat. So first off, I'm going to be asking questions of all the panelists, but please, folks, keep your eye on the links that are in the chat. We want you to be able to support the work that all of these organizations are doing. Support it financially, volunteer with them, follow them, sign up for their lists. Judith, I want to come back to you, and hopefully others will be able to riff off this. I know that Native Organizers Alliance runs a lot of trainings, and both as part of those trainings, but also from what I gather, and please correct me if I'm wrong, just part of your entire theory of change in part relies on emphasizing the influence of Native elders and other traditional practices in your organizing work. And I'd love it if you could just speak to how and why working with elders in particular is so core and important to your organizing work?
Well, I'm an elder. I'm excited to be an elder because now I'm always guaranteed a good cup of coffee as soon as I enter a meeting in Indian country. I'm given a chair right away, and during Standing Rock, when we were in the prayer camp, I was always given a blanket. So I've been waiting all of my life for these privileges, and I'm very excited to be exercising them full tilt in our work. Well, we put a lot of emphasis on intergenerational organizing. And our training programs, we train hundreds of tribal leaders, traditional leaders, and Native community organizers to use our traditional values as a guide to how we walk in the 21st century. And one of the most basic indigenous concept is the idea of relationality. All my relations, we are all in relationship to one another. And it is the only time, the present is the only time when the past and the future come together. And so that is why elders and young people must be brought together in the present in order to walk together based on that knowledge of our past, so that we'll know which way to go in the future. But all that talk about the past and the future only comes together when we're working together in the present. So elders carry knowledge and experience, but not all elders are wisdom carriers. So we need to work intergenerationally in order to have a circle of understanding of the past, the present, and the future. And so young people are a critical part of our enabling elders and traditional leaders to play their role, because alone we have experience. I know I've been to a bunch of rodeos, but we need the young people in order to inform how our past experiences actually are a guide for what we do today.
Right. Dominique, you had mentioned right off the bat how Mom's Clean Air Force is truly intergenerational, and obviously caregivers can be pretty much every age or any age. I'm curious, are there unique challenges, unique strengths to working with an intergenerational movement or an intergenerational group?
There are wonderful challenges to it and incredible strengths. Issues of idealism, who is idealistic and how do you hold idealism, and how at the same time do you try to be pragmatic. These are things that we discuss from every angle of the age spectrum. I think as well, there is something about being an older person that I think by the time we hit 60, most of us have had the experience of facing mortality, either in ourselves or in our loved ones, and it focuses the mind. And I've been reading a lot about how older people care about their legacies. I don't care about my legacy for when I'm dead. I care about my legacy right now. And I think as an older person, living a legacy is incredibly important. The things that are keeping me up at night are very different from the things that are keeping a 25 or 30-year-old up at night, but might stem from the same thing. And I think to Judith's part of what we can do working with younger people at the same time is to model resilience and defiance and strength, and the idea that you don't give up, and this is how you fight despair. And I think that and I get that also from the young people I work with. So there's a wonderful, rich emotional and character bath that we're all working in intergenerationally. And I think it's incredibly, incredibly important. I am still waiting for somebody to give me a blanket, but that's okay.
All right. Uh, Bill, I think a lot of people are aware of the amazing divestment work that you did with 350 and elsewhere, and obviously a lot of that took place on campuses. Third Act is something completely different. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the differences between working with younger activists and older activists. And maybe bear in mind that there are a lot of organizers listening to you right now. I'm not asking you to like teach us, but like are there things that you wish you knew 15, 20 years ago about how to interact with older volunteers, how to work with older activists? Are there things that you're learning now in this new stage of your activism? Oh, Bill, you're muted. Oh, Bill, we're still having trouble hearing you.
Well, I'm unmuted, so I don't
Oh,
know.
there we go.
There you go. I've mostly worked with young people, but and we still do a ton of work with young people. I think, truthfully, one of the secrets of older people is that no one thinks of themselves as old. You were the same people we always were, with the same set of interests and values and things. Um, um, but but with extraordinary power that has been underutilized. The conventional political science wisdom is that people become more conservative as they age. And there are lots of forces in our society that try to push us in that direction. I mean, Fox News is an organization that built its entire business model on scaring old people, you know. Um, so it, no, there's been we've under prioritized organizing with older people. There's 70 million of us over the age of 60. That's bigger than the population of France. We punch above our weight politically because we basically all vote. There's no known way really to stop old people from voting. And we ended up with, though not everybody's affluent or comfortable, taken as a whole, we've got like 2/3 of the country's money. Which means that if you want to push around Wall Street or whatever, just like City Hall, it's a good group to be organizing in. And the only other thing I'll say about organizing older people as opposed to young people is when you're organizing college kids and things, people don't stay young all that long. They're pretty quick out into the next part of their life. But if you organize someone who's 63 or something, uh, uh, demographically, they've got another quarter century of good work to do, and that's what we've got. In 2 years, we've got 75,000 people across the country, uh, and the main thing they want is more work to do. I'll just finish by saying the other lesson, the other difference about organizing older people is not only do they have skills and resources and networks, they also have time. And time is the most precious commodity for an organizer that there could possibly be. It ranks right up there with the idealism of young people. And so and I guess one more thing just to say, it's most fun when we work together and don't take ourselves too seriously. The very first action that Third Act did two or 3 years ago was because Fridays for the Future asked us to help taking on these banks. They were like, most of us don't have credit cards, can you help us take on these banks? We were like, sure. And I remember the first protest I went to, there were 200 or 300 high school kids there because they understand what they're staring down the barrel of. But and they are somewhat sprier than we are, so they were at the head of the march. But at the back, there was a big crowd of bunch of third actors with a big banner that just said "Fossils against fossil fuels," and all the kids who saw it started laughing and high-fiving us and each other and things, and it was the right spirit to be taking on this work.
I love that. I love it. I love it. Uh, Francis, you kind of come at this from both ends. I mean, I think everybody does as both an organizer and a volunteer and activist. What are some of the things that you look for on both ends. And so, as a volunteer, when you're looking for opportunities to get involved, what are some of the things that attract you? But also, as part of Elders Climate Action or Climate Action Now, what are some things that you think are really good ways to attract and retain older volunteers?
I think everybody has different things they're attracted to. I mean, for me, I think a chance to do some new things, meet some new people, learn something new, maybe do something a little surprising. I still remember showing up at the Mom's Clean Air Force play-in a few minutes late because I got lost. And the next thing I know, I'm a giant monarch butterfly in a children's skit, which I wasn't really expecting. I've also found myself trying to dance the electric slide dressed as a large building on the steps of the county council. So get a chance to do something a little different. But before this, I was trying to read a public service commission order. So sometimes a little more serious than that. And I think I'm a people person. I like to have an opportunity to meet new people, work with them, develop relationships, collaborate, see where we can go. And so I think those are a lot of people like those. Some people, though, are going to be a little bit more introverted. They're going to maybe want to do something a little bit more sedentary, a little bit more stay at home. The pandemic's been a big deal with that. So it's going to vary from person to person. I think for our volunteers, flexibility matters a lot. I mean, Judith mentioned grandchildren. That's frequently an issue for a lot of people, or issues, other family issues, other health issues. Being able to work flexibly, I think makes a big difference for a lot of people, and being able to contribute in a variety of ways. I was thinking about when Bill was talking, one of our members who has been part of the Rocking Chair Rebellion, but also likes to run a book club at the library, which are kind of maybe different ends of a spectrum of approaches to being an activist. So people can do a real variety of things. In terms of trying to organize people, one thing I look for is to try to help people kind of find their niche. I mean, some people like me like to try a lot of different things. Some people really want to kind of settle down into one particular part of things. They're really very good as policy experts, or very good at organizing events, or we have some wonderful writers and editors who work on our newsletter. People have a variety of talents and interests and skills, and trying to help people find the niche that really works for them, and also trying to build relationships. We're a relatively small organization, but I think we do punch above our weight, partly because we are avid collaborators, and we really try to work with other groups and build those relationships. And finding people who are good at doing that is always a great find.
That is wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you. So I always love sticking to schedule, and we are precisely 15 minutes before the end of our time together. And so I'm going to hand it over to Shannon, who's got some questions from our enormous audience here. Thank you all for being part of this. But before I do hand it over to Shannon, I do just want to remind all attendees, please use those links in the chat. Elders Climate Action, Moms Clean Air Force, Native Organizers Alliance, Third Act. They are all doing extraordinary work. Sign up for their lists, support their work, be a part of their work as volunteers or supporters. Please, please, please do it. We all know how important this year is. But I will hand it over to Shannon, who's got some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think this question is inspired by some of the last things that you were mentioning, Bill, but I think it's a great question for everyone. What got you all interested in organizing in the first place? Are you lifelong organizers across a whole bunch of issues? Was it climate specifically? And if you'd like to add to it, how is it different now than when you got started?
I'm happy to jump in on that because I want to pick up on something Bill said. We don't feel older. And indeed, I feel like I felt when I was 15 and a raging feminist and out there, demonstrating for women's rights. So that level of activism has been part of my life for a long time. But I do want to say, since we're talking about older voters, we have about a 1.5 million members around the country, and they're drawn to what we do because of children's health. But this past year, especially, I have really been aware of the impacts of climate, extreme heat and air pollution on older bodies. And Hazel Chandler, for example, we spoke about, who's living in Arizona, talked about not being able to use the handrails going up to the state capitol, the metal rails, because they were too hot, and she had to carry an oven mitt all the time. And I think thinking about the impact of climate change on older people and talking about that and writing about that and doing research on that is incredibly important. So where my activism was triggered by protecting children, I'm also feeling extremely passionate about, hey, we have to think about the unique vulnerabilities of aging in climate disruption.
I'm always interested in hearing how people got involved in organizing. And I'm 72, and I feel like it was such a privilege to be young in the late 60s and 70s, because it was a magic movement moment where, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the, civil rights, the women's movement, and the American Indian movement were all in a surge moment. And people had a perspective. I had this perspective that was, we have to do what we must do. So my first real heavy duty, all in experiences right after the Wounded Knee occupation on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, 1973. I moved there to work with the lawyers who were representing the hundreds of people who were indicted after that occupation. But the beautiful thing is that it created a new norm. The late 60s, 70s created a norm so that when we went into the 80s and Reagan was elected, there was a surge that was built upon the past 2 decades of organizing and mobilizing. So, I worked for the AFL-CIO for the youth council, for a youth council called Frontlash, and to mobilize the youth contingent of Solidarity Day, the first time there'd been 1 million workers in response to the busting of the air traffic control workers union by Reagan. And in every period, although we might not always be in a surge, there is a surge. It creates a new normal, and people like ourselves are impacted, everyday people. And so you see, kind of looking towards the future, how do I plug into the next surge? Right now, we're in a surge as well that's been going on since Bush, where we've had some laws, but since Bush left office, but we've also had these surges where the people who participated were impacted by the narrative of what went on during the Bush administration and the launching of the Iraq War. They're helping now to lead what is an even bigger push to defend democracy. I run into so many young people said, first demonstration I ever went to was against the war in Iraq. And now I'm working with young organizers who are in high school. And I'm actually working with some of the grandchildren from Wounded Knee, some of the Wounded Knee veterans' grandchildren. But the truth is that when you're in motion, you gain insights. And we've been in motion now for many, many decades, a lot of rodeos. And that, to me, is so important in leadership, to look at historical periods and the role that everyday people have played, because that's what gives you sustenance. That's what helps you look at the horizon and say, I want to keep walking towards that horizon, and I want to bring as many people as I can and be a collaborator and a co-conspirator in making it better for the future generations.
Amen. You know, I'm not an organizer by background. I was a writer, and I wrote the first book about climate change. And for some years after that, thought that that was my job, was to go on writing and speaking and things. Because I thought that we were in an argument, and that once we'd won the argument, then our leaders would do the right thing, because why wouldn't they? And it took me a while, until, I don't know, sometime in the early aughts, to figure out that we'd won the argument, but we were losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and reason and evidence. The fight was about what fights are usually about: money and power. And the other side of this fight, the fossil fuel industry, was so rich and powerful that they could, didn't matter if they lost the argument, they could keep their business model alive. So we've been fighting. That's when we started organizing. And you asked sort of how things were different then. I mean, 350.org was the first attempt at a kind of global grassroots climate campaign. And because it was an unfilled ecological niche, it expanded very quickly. Our first day of action had 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries around the world. And it was amazing to watch it grow, and amazing to watch the young people who came in, say, to do the divestment work, graduate to go on and form the Sunrise Movement and get us the Inflation Reduction Act eventually, and, you know, on and on and on. So this sense that the movement is a living, breathing thing that Judith so powerfully brings out is just right. And the truth is, we're still in the very middle of this fight. And some of it's electoral and with voters, and the great work that EVP is doing to identify people is a key part of that. And some of it continues to be in the streets. We'll be in Washington next month trying to stop the Department of Energy from licensing any more of these huge LNG export terminals, because they're the biggest single fossil fuel expansion project on planet Earth. And we're training up. We had our first big webinar sort of training series on nonviolent civil disobedience at Third Act last week, and there were 1,700 people online checking it out and figuring out how to take part. So don't sleep on any of this work, is my advice. Together, we're all doing remarkable things, and EVP has done us a real service in reminding everyone that this is not some niche constituency. This is one of the central parts of American politics.
Francis.
Yep. Yeah, I don't think I ever really set out to become an organizer. In my professional career, I did a lot of organizing programs and projects, but not outside of sort of that context. And when I retired in large part, not totally, because I thought that I really did want to focus more on climate than I could, especially as a federal employee in the Trump administration. But I was civil service, but there are only certain things that work in that setting. But getting into it, it's sort of like, oh, we need somebody to do this, we need somebody to do that, and it just kind of grew. And I think for me, that was probably the best way for it to happen, to see what the opportunities were and how my talents and skills could fit into that.
I think each of you really got at a point that really was going to be my last question, but I'll kind of reiterate to the folks that had asked, what's the one thing I can do? I have limited time, or I have limited energy. What's the one thing I can do? And I don't want to answer for any of you, but what I'm hearing is do what you're passionate about, do what you're good at. We need people to do all of the things. There's not one thing. And it sounds like each of you really just spoke to like what you have chosen to do and what potentially the folks who are here with us could do. All right.
So your research about the voters who don't vote is quite staggering. And, you know, it reminds us that we really can't take anything for granted. So if there's one thing you can do and you care about climate, get out and vote. Get people registered to vote, do all that. That's quite stunning.
I would say find community, like if it's your neighbors, if it's your extended family, if it's an organization that's, you know, that you want to kind of run with, find a circle, become a part of it, because moving alone is not enough. We have to move majorities. The fact is, the majority of people globally and in this country believe that something must be done about climate crisis. That's a majority opinion. We're not going to deal with the threats to democracy without moving majorities. That is a majority issue. So in order to move majorities, we have to be connected. We have to, as we say in Indian country, be in a circle, be in community, knowing our role in a circle, to do what we can within a circle. Because you know what? You don't know what to do unless you are with others who are doing things. You don't know if you're being a good relative, if you're being a good custodian for our descendants, unless it's being reflected back to you in a circle. So find community and move with it. That's what we need right now. Be it voting or being in the streets with Bill. I hope to be there myself, or making phone calls, whatever it is, being in community, being in a circle is what's key right now.
I just want to echo that. Americans too often default to individual action faced with anything. We're way past the point where we're going to solve the climate crisis one Tesla at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to change the economic and political ground rules. That's why we start things like Third Act. And everybody's welcome. We don't really check your ID at the door, so, you know, whatever. And see everybody down the road at the polls, in the streets, everywhere else.
And I want to thank you all. I've been saying this for years, having the privilege to work with many of your organizations, but as an elder in training, hopefully I can get there. I really want to echo all of our participants as well, who are thanking you each for being here. I know this is not the last that we will hear from all of you from Native Organizers Alliance, Elders Climate Action, Third Act, and Moms Clean Air Force. And I hope for all of you joining us today, all of your participants, I hope that this is not the last that you are in touch with all of these organizations. So check the chat, but also check your emails tomorrow. We will send them all there so you don't have to work to try to save everything quickly. So I know we all can't see.
Shannon and Nathaniel, thank you both for really great leadership and great moderation tonight. This was a wonderful hour.
As we say in Indian country, oh, yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.